Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andrea Armeni. I am the Executive Director of Transform Finance and the convener of the Transform Finance Investor Network. Thank you for joining us today for this discussion on the role of investors in fostering a just transition, a topic that, as we've seen from the number of people joining, is very much of interest and something that many of you have been exploring. And we're fortunate that today we will be joined by Vonda Brunsting, formerly of the SEIU Capital Stewardship team, and now with the Initiative for Responsible Investment at Harvard University, where she is the project manager, program manager for the Just Transition project. As you join in, just as a quick tech check, you will notice, if you've been with us before, that the WebEx interface has changed slightly. If you can, please mute yourself, and if you need to speak up, you can unmute yourself or send a note, or even do it via the chat function. So you will see that there is a little chat box towards the bottom as one of those little bubbles. So with that, let's get started, and we do hope that you'll be able to join in. As you will see from Vonda's presentation today, she is very much looking to get some feedback from investors that have been looking at this issue, as well as if there are any who joined us from affected communities or from worker groups. We would very much welcome your input on this conversation as well. So a quick note, you probably saw in the link that we sent yesterday in the reminder that we had included a link to the guide for investor action that Vonda had shared with us. It came to our attention that it's actually embargoed until September 14th. So please feel free to reach out to us on September 14th or to Vonda if you want to be notified, or if you want to get a copy when it's released. But for now, do not distribute it if you have already downloaded the copy from the link that we had provided. The team that worked on the guide would very much appreciate it if you could keep it internal until the release on September 14th. A couple of quick updates from the Investor Network, and in particular for our members and prospective members. Welcome back, everyone, from your summer break. You'll notice we did not have a webinar in August. We took it as an opportunity to recharge a little bit, and we hope you did the same, and to think a little bit about the programming for the fall. A couple of quick things. One, regarding SOCAP. Many of you, as always, will be gathering there. So we are currently planning on a series of sessions within the theme of alternative ownership, something that we have covered within the work of the Investor Network for quite a while. We'll be announcing those sessions soon as we finalize them with the SOCAP content team. And we'll be doing, as always, a little Transform Finance gathering there. So please let us know if you're planning on being at SOCAP. And I have just returned from the Outback Forum in Austria, where we worked for a few days on a declaration on principles for impact investing. There was no declaration issued, but you've probably seen that both the GIN and the World Bank IFC have been working on principles for impact. So that's something that is very much a topic at the moment. And again, we encourage you to reach out to us and let us know if you have any views on both the need for principles and what those principles should be. And with respect to Transform Finance, I'm quite delighted that during the meeting at Outback, there was a consensus on the 3 principles that we've been working on in terms of deep engagement of communities in design, governance, and ownership, the creation of more value for the stakeholders than what is taken out by investors, and the fair allocation of risks and returns among all stakeholders. So something that a few years ago seemed to be a little bit at the fringes of the impact investing community is now actually being highlighted within some of the sets of principles that we're seeing going around. Also, for those of you that had worked with us on the report on innovative financing structures that we put out with the Inter-American Development Bank last year, we are going to be releasing soon an updated version with some new case studies. If you have done anything on alternative deal structures or innovative financing structures, please do send them our way. Let's talk about it. And I'm announcing the next webinar, which will be with Erin Sahan. Some of you might remember him from our earlier conversation when he was at Oxfam. He's now the CEO of the World Fair Trade Organization. And we'll be talking about different enterprise structures across the world of the WFTO that structurally are set up in a way that prioritizes social impact. Again, a topic that I imagine is still of interest to you. So turning to today's topic of the just transition and the role of the investors within the just transition, from our perspective, it goes back to the usual quote from Aner Ben-Ami, right? We should, at the very least, be asking the question for every investment we make, is this a strategy that helps redefine who wins and who loses in our economy, right? Are we able to say that the investments that we're looking at, in this case, the just transition case, on the move from a carbon economy to a new economy, who will win and who will lose from that transition? And you might remember that this is not at all an abstract question. In the investor briefing on renewable energy impacts on local communities that we put out a while back, together with the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, we highlighted some of the very stark negative impacts on, in particular, indigenous communities in the Global South, and more generally, the human rights implications of some renewable energy projects, ranging from land grabs to violations of the rights to free, prior, and informed consent, to violence and intimidation against human rights defenders. Today we're going to be looking at that a little bit more broadly from the lens of the just transition that Vonda will be highlighting for us. Now, we will need, as we've said before, for this transition to be both fast and fair, right? We don't want the good, as Morgan Simon says, to be the enemy of the perfect or something that comes closer to the perfect, right? The urgency of action around climate should not mean that somebody is left to bear the consequences that is not in the best position to do so. And I hope that we can broaden it for today's discussion and also for your work more generally to the broader context of workers in society, right? And how the way that capital is being allocated and the way consumption and our lifestyles are proceeding, how workers are being affected more broadly, and how there is a change in the dynamics of labor, something that we have highlighted in previous work here that we're doing with NYU Stern and with Ford. That might leave the workers kind of on the bad receiving end of the changes that we're currently seeing. So I want to see after Vonda's presentation how we can take up this multiple just transitions, or rather multiple transitions that there are now, and how the framework that they have developed can be applied to something like the gig economy, to automation, and to other dynamics that we're seeing that are negatively affecting workers generally. Now, the last thing that I will highlight there in terms of the structural implications of investments in a context of this sort is around the impact methodology that we have been developing and seeking to capture beyond the product or service that might be conducive to a just transition, also all the positive and negative impacts on all other stakeholders, right? Who is ultimately benefiting from the transition in terms of the type of customers that are being included, how are the workers being treated, is there an element of ownership on communities that we can that can be baked into the projects that are being financed, and the methodology that you all by now should be somewhat familiar with really aims to operationalize almost in a due diligence or impact audit way many of the principles around the just transition, so that as we're solving a problem that largely we have created, right, in terms of the carbonization of the economy and a problem that we are facing now in terms of climate change, or be mindful of how the others that are more on the receiving end are being affected by this, and to which extent are they in a better or in a worse position than other stakeholders to bear the cost of that and those problems, right? We don't want to be punting onto different constituents the cost of the transition that we need to be creating. So with that, I am delighted to welcome Vonda Brunsting, who has been a great thought partner on a lot of our work throughout the years. She's been closely associated with Transform Finance for a while, and we're really excited to see the work that she, David Wood, and Nick Robbins have been doing on this. So with that, Vonda, I will turn it over to you with many thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Andrea. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Great. And so I'll be able to control the slides then, right? Yes. Okay. So let me just begin by thanking Andrea and Transform Finance for inviting me. I have been in full of admiration for the work that all of you do, and am excited to continue the journey together as we try to figure out the just transition and what it means for investors. I also don't necessarily like webinars speaking because I feel like I'm talking into the void. So I appreciate those of you who have your cameras on the top of my screen so I can actually feel like I'm talking to someone. So thanks for that. And hopefully after I talk a little bit about the work that we're doing in the project itself, we'll have time for a discussion so more people can engage. So you should have in front of you an agenda, and I'll just go through it for those who may not have access to the slides. What I'm hoping to talk about is introducing the topic of the just transition by putting it into the context of the Paris Accord and some other writings that have been floating out there, and then put the just transition in context, a little bit of historical and economic context. Then I want to talk about the project and then really turn to what investors might do. So what's our challenge? Why should we even care? And then how we might act if we choose to take action, and then where to start. So that's the plan for the next 45 minutes or so, and I will call on Andrea to either speed me up if I'm going too slow, or to slow me down if you think I'm going too fast, or people can use the chat function if you want to. Let me just start with what many of us have been involved with for some time, and that is the Paris Accord. So in the preamble, after much work, this phrase was included, and it simply says that the imperatives of a just transition of the workforce and the creation of decent work and quality jobs in accordance with nationally defined development priorities. So I just want to start by asking people to think for a minute what comes to your mind when you hear the phrase just transition. And so you can either jot a couple words down or use the chat function, which will allow us all to see the couple words or phrase that comes to mind when you hear the word or the phrase just transition. And so just again, the chat is on the bottom of your screen. There's a little bubble inside one of those circles, and if you hover over it, it says chat. And if you click on it, you'll be able to send out to everybody a couple words and share it with everybody. So I'll just give you a minute to do that, and Andrea will help me sort of scan through while we do it. And of course, if you can't put anything into the chat, feel free to just write it down for your own benefit, and maybe we can bring it into the conversation later. Thanks to Lila. So one of the things that I've often heard when I say just transition, people say that it brings to mind the transition from coal. So what happens when workers in coal mining regions, when they lose their jobs? And I think that what you've seen from the Paris Accord, and also from the definition that I put below it from the International Trade Union Confederation is that we're talking about the just transition in a much broader frame. And so the ITUC has said that the just transition is an economy-wide process that produces the plans, policies, and investments that lead us to a future where all jobs are green and decent, emissions are at net zero, poverty is eradicated, and communities are thriving and resilient. And so I think that measures more with what folks are putting up on the chat. I think just from the handful that I'm seeing, more of an inclusive approach that impacts not only workers but also communities and goes beyond to think about a preference for the poor, which is part of our Catholic social teaching. So I appreciate that and continue to write that in there as we go on. The just transition as a term, as far as I can tell, really started out of trade unions in the U.S., actually in New Jersey, with a man named Tony Mazzocchi, who is from the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union, and that union is now part of the steel workers. So in the 90s, they negotiated a super fund for workers when a chemical plant was closed in New Jersey after much opposition from government officials and from environmental groups. And so what Tony said was that because this plant was being closed, given the pressure from policymakers and environmental groups, that he expected income protection and retraining for the 650 workers at the plant. And he argued that because of the threats by policy, workers should be protected. And I think that raises for me how many see the just transition, and that is it lies in the hands of government. And so that's something that I want to talk more about as we go through this. But for me, the just transition is also very personal. I grew up in the Rust Belt in Michigan. My father and my uncles all worked in auto parts factories that were all tied to the automotive industry on the other side of the state in Detroit. And they were decent jobs, not much in the way of benefits or retirement savings. They were non-union, but they were jobs. But I watched those erode over the 70s and 80s. And as those jobs moved to the south of the U.S. or to Mexico, you know, we couldn't have imagined that our families would be moved with them, which is also something I think that's expected in people's minds, that as you know, coal mines close and workers can follow the jobs elsewhere, which in practical terms doesn't always work that way. But I was raised really with the conviction that these industrial jobs were something to put value in and enough to raise a family on. And in fact, I remember my family was very religious, and on Sunday mornings you would always find us in church. And if you drove a car into the church parking lot that was foreign made, you were harassed. So you knew better to park it far away. And in fact, when I dated someone with a Toyota, it was not looked well upon by my relatives. So that was a different time. I think that wouldn't happen in West Michigan today. And yet the transition that I think we're facing in the Rust Belt has not been managed well. And so if we didn't manage that one well, what about the next one? So I also want to turn to, let's see, I have to move the slide forward. Hold on a second. I'm just lost my screen. Another set of work that's, I think, influenced the narrative around the just transition, and that is the Pope's encyclical on climate, Laudato Si, which came out in 2015, and then recently a document that the press release from the Vatican called "Money Must Not Rule." The document itself was called "Considerations for an Ethical Discernment Regarding Some Aspects of the Present Economic Financial System." And so you can see why they turned that into shorthand, "Money must not rule." But I really like this. They brought into the discussion about our economic situation the notion of the common good. As you can see in this quote, that's the purpose of our economic financial system. And then they end with after 10 pages of a pretty harsh critique of our economic system and talking about finance in terms of the evil and the theft that goes into it, they say at the end of the document, in front of the massiveness and pervasiveness of today's economic financial systems, we could be tempted to abandon ourselves to cynicism and to think that with our poor forces, we can do very little. In reality, every one of us can do so much, especially if one does not remain alone. And I love that because it both calls on all of us to act and it also calls on us to act together. And so that's my hope, that we can do both. But this whole notion of finance as service, I feel like has been lost. I remember, I think it was in 2012, someone can correct me, after the financial crisis, after Occupy Wall Street, SEIU and other active shareholders were involved in something called Shareholder Spring. And I found myself that May at a Morgan Stanley shareholder meeting, AGM. And we were there with our group of community and labor members and waiting for the meeting to begin. And so I was paging through the annual report from Morgan Stanley, and they talked about their mission in 1935 being providing financial services to people. And maybe that's obvious to everybody, but I was really surprised by that because I felt like we had fallen so far away from it. I went back to try to find that mission statement, and they seem to have changed it, so I'm not quite sure what that means. So we think that the just transition provides a frame by which we can both mitigate the impacts of emissions that are currently with us and to help communities adapt as we make the societal shift to a sustainable low-carbon economy or maybe a zero-carbon economy over the next few decades. So that's the frame from which I'm approaching this work, and that we're hoping to really think about the role of investors. So I want to go into just a little bit more about the context for the just transition briefly, because I feel like everyone probably knows what's on the screen here, which says the just transition explained. The action to the Paris Accord must be accelerated, right? The International Energy Agency estimates that $3.5 trillion in US dollars of energy sector investments are needed each year, 3.5 trillion from now until 2050. And that the energy efficiency investments in buildings and transportation and industry need to be increased tenfold. So that's a pretty daunting assignment. And of course, I think the other piece of it is that the economic development and job creation opportunities are huge. It could be a huge economic driver. The International Labor Organization estimates that the action to meet the Paris goals could create 24 million jobs. Loss estimates are at 6 million, which, you know, puts us way out ahead if we do this right. And will those be decent jobs, which is a huge concern for us, for those of us who've been part of the labor movement and really working on behalf of workers more broadly. And so beyond the economic development opportunities, the expectation is that 1.5 billion workers at minimum will be impacted, a huge number in agricultural sectors. And then we know it's a system-wide challenge. It's not just, you know, looking at the positive employment opportunities, but it's also managing the social costs. And now, as I've mentioned, we've seen action beginning in government, in the business community. There's an effort that's been started by something called the B Team. Trade unions, the International Trade Union Confederation has launched a Just Transition Center, and civil society efforts all over the globe, really. And so we think that the Just Transition might be a model for us to manage the change that we need. And I just wanted to go through a couple of places that are taking this on. South Africa led the way in 2015 around the Paris Accord, with including the just transition in its nationally determined contribution. In Canada, this spring actually, they launched the task force on the just transition for Canadian coal power workers and communities. In Australia, we've seen in May a partnership agreement for the Latrobe Valley workers, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. In Italy, the energy utility Enel has committed to decarbonize their energy mix by 2050 and have agreed to a global framework. And then in the U.S., there's a Just Transition Fund, which has used federal funds and grant making to support bottom-up innovation in coal communities. And if someone is on from the Just Transition Fund, hopefully we can hear more about that. So we have seen this being picked up across the globe. In addition to Canada, I think Scotland, New Zealand, other countries have launched these commissions. So I guess that leaves us with what's the role of investors? And so that's what I want to turn to now. So I was...
Can I ask you, Vonda, one
Yep.
clarification that already came up on this? So when we're talking about just transition, and you had in, I think in the ITUC definition, this idea of the green economy, there seems to be still some confusion between just transition, meaning jobs that go from coal to clean energy, right? Kind of a one-to-one relation, versus jobs that might go from coal or otherwise to an economy that is consistent with a 2-degree scenario, but don't necessarily need to be within the clean tech or clean energy space. And when you were comparing the 24 million number to the 6 million number, I imagine those are a direct one-to-one relationship within the context of moving to the clean energy jobs, right? They're not jobs more in general.
Yeah, I think that the data that we have has looked at the transition in terms of workers in the most affected sectors around oil and gas and agriculture, transport. But I think that, well, certainly for our project, and I know in talking to the ITUC, that the frame is much larger, right? Because there's so many more workers, healthcare workers impacted, you know, first responders. There's so many sectors in the service economy as well where jobs are going to be impacted in both positive and negative ways. So if that's your question, I think I would not read that definition narrowly, I would read it broadly. Does that answer your question?
Great, thank you. Yeah, and we'll pick it up later, I think, if Anair can jump on the line, because he had looked in the past in some of the work that we've been doing on these opportunities in communities where, say, the coal jobs might be going away, but you don't have a comparable number of clean energy jobs, let's say, coming up. And how one can think through the just transition framework in terms of other types of jobs that would be created in that community. But I think we can leave that for later. I just wanted to flag it as, you know, from old jobs to new jobs, which jobs we're actually thinking about.
Talking about, right.
The new side. But let's make sure that we touch on that later. Thank you.
Okay, all right. The project that we've started to really tackle the investor role came about a year ago when Nick Robbins and I were talking. Nick, who had spent years at the UN environmental program and came out of asset management, and for me, a decade or more of working with labor pension funds and public pension funds in my role at the Service Employees International Union. And quite frankly, we were complaining, Nick about Brexit and me about the election in the US, and thought about the political disruption that was taking place and was that connected to a lack of a transition and the changes for the workforce. And, you know, we recounted, because both of us had been interested in the just transition, what was happening, but really felt like no one was tackling the question of how could we make a case for investors to engage and what might they do. Although, since then I found that folks have been working on this question, and I think it's really been brought into people's minds partly from the Sustainable Development Goals, that this is part of how people view investors' work to address that need as well. So that's the project. Nick is now at the Grantham Research Institute at LSE. I am now at the Initiative for Responsible Investment at Harvard, along with my colleague David Wood. and we're working in partnership with the Principles for Responsible Investment and also the International Trade Union Confederation, and hopefully as many people as possible, frankly. So I'm very interested to bring this into the Transform Finance community. We have an international advisory committee. I think it tends towards investors who have come at this from the same background as Nick and I, global. We have a great global group, but I feel like we need to have more community members on there. So again, if folks have ideas for me, you can be in touch. And our goals really are to develop this case for investor action, try to provide some guidance for investors on how to take action, and then what we're hoping to do, so we've done that, that's sort of been 2018. What we're hoping to do in 2019, although we're under-resourced and have just a handful of staff, is really work with a vanguard of investors who want to take the guidance that we're developing it and implement it into their portfolio. And so we have launched a guidance that Andrea referenced in the beginning that people will have access to next week. And then we also have a statement for investors to sign on to, which already has, and I can send a link around to that. You're all more than welcome, and I hope will join that effort. And then out of that, I think will be the learning that needs to take place to actually figure out what this means. And then the more, I mean, I think the other piece of it that I think we also need to tackle and have not done much work on is how this impacts place-based projects, because I feel like that's where we're really going to understand the just transition in local geographies, and we have done some work on that, particularly in Yorkshire in the UK. But again, I'm relying on this community for more examples and ideas on the place-based work. I feel like you've been leading the way around things such as impact investing. So that's our project. Here's some questions in addition to the ones that I just asked you. How can investors make the just transition part of your investment strategy? Where can investors use their voice as owners? How can investors make a difference to place-led solutions? And then how do we best engage frontline communities along with investors, labor, policymakers, and business? And in this regard, I am not often in places where all of these communities come together. In fact, rarely. In my work at SEIU, when we would go to conferences and talk about different aspects of our responsible investment work, we often would bring a worker with us. And I think that was unusual in many cases, but that was just sort of the tip of what I think we need to do, is think about how to interface more between investors and communities and workers. And so again, ideas on that would be more than welcome. So the challenge here is big. We know that the risks and opportunities are, both to look at it from the decarbonization aspect as well as doing inclusive growth are challenging. It's not just a local issue, it's global. It's both developed and developing economies. It's comprehensive. It's not just in coal or in a particular sector. It's really across the entire economic sector spectrum, as well as across our entire investment portfolio. It has the opportunity, I think, to unify, for those of us who've worked around ESG issues, combining those, and it's really distributed and tied to place. And then, of course, systemic issues have been, I think investors are starting to confront, and I know some on the call might be involved with Steve Leidenberg's new project on systemic risk, but this is a challenge where we've started to tackle it in terms of climate, but how do we add into it issues of the social dimension, human rights, and the just transition, of course. So big challenges. And then what is the role of investors? So this is from the European High Commission, where they say there is a role for investors. I think I'm stating the obvious here, but the way they think about it is that sustainable finance has a role, I would say all finance, and we need to make sure that the shift away from high carbon produces net benefits for workers and communities. So there's our mandate. How do we do it? I'm just going to go through the case that we've developed, which is not exhaustive, but in the interest of time, I'll go through this as quickly as I can. We think that there's a strong case to be made for investors, and that investors may approach this from different doorways. If you think about the 6 things that I've listed on the screen as 6 doorways, you might enter it through one or another, or it might mean that all of them have relevance for where you sit within your pension fund or your asset management business or foundation. So I started here with materiality. I guess it's sort of like, eat your Brussels sprouts first. Although I do now like Brussels sprouts, so that doesn't really work like it did when I was a kid. But materiality really drives the work we do for many of us as investors. We're responsible for the savings of workers, the savings of our clients, and we need to have a return. And investors, I think, understand that that balance between risk and return is a leading driver of how we think about our portfolio. And then taking it down to our company level, we want to know how companies are managing this. And what I've put here is human capital management, a perfect example of it. And I just want to highlight the work that, I don't know if Cambria Allen is on the phone, but her leadership in bringing that issue to the forefront at the UAW-VIBA, along with all the other investors that are part of that effort. I think there's a roundtable with the SEC next week, so maybe Cambria can say more about that if she's here with us. So then moving to the norms, the international law and the things that govern the way we invest. And for us in the U.S., a huge consideration is our fiduciary duty. And so, we find our obligations stretching over generations. And so how do we represent that within perhaps this world of ESG, and is the just transition then a way for us to think about a multi-generational impact through how we manage our assets? So the beneficiaries is related to that, right? One of the funds that I talked to in Australia called CBIS, which is one of the superannuation schemes, they manage the retirement savings of laborers and construction workers, and found that in the announcements to shutter a lot of the coal-fired plants in Australia, their members were going to lose their jobs. And so how do they manage the fact that they're investing in ways perhaps that are costing their beneficiaries? And so they actually, with a couple other funds in Australia and the IGCC, have prepared a document, again, which I can share, that looks at the just transition in the Australian context, which might provide some insights for us. The other issue around beneficiaries, I can speak to from my seat at the Unitarian Universalist Association, where I'm part of the SRI and the investment committee for the Common Endowment Fund. And, we had a very vocal drive to divest from fossil fuels a number of years ago. And we're, because of the way our governance works, required to do so, but held on to shares as a way of engaging with companies. So we've always engaged with oil and gas companies. I think we're doing even more. And I think that it's because our beneficiaries have demanded it of us, in addition to, I think, a direction that we wanted to go. And so that is going to, we need to pay attention to that. I think most of us understand. Of course, there's opportunities, right? This is the way we think about the investment world. What are the opportunities here? So as we shift to decentralized renewables, for example, that will bring structural changes that might offer new opportunities for us to address inequality. One way, I think, is perhaps the structural changes in the energy sector that might provide for a greater role for communities' involvement and ownership. So that's exciting to think about. And maybe some examples from people who are here with us. Of course, I touched on systemic risk, and I just want to, and I can share more information on this, but draw on the work that my colleague David Wood has been doing on inequality. I think a couple years ago, when we talked to folks, they couldn't quite wrap their mind around how we would tackle inequality in the investment world, and now there's a whole work stream starting on that. And then, as I also already referenced, investors are now thinking about how we can contribute to the SDGs. So, and other global societal goals that have been, being developed over the last couple of years. So there's a lot of reasons for us to take part. Choose one, choose all. Anything I should add, Andrea, before I go on? Okay, I'll keep going. So I just wanted to then turn really to what we might do. So here there's 5 things. None of them hopefully are strange to anyone on the call. What we thought was that because it's a very big multi-dimensional challenge, why not start with what we know how to do? So for example, we know how to do corporate engagement, so let's just add the just transition. We don't have to start all over. So these 5 areas I'm going to go into in some detail on the next few slides and in the next few minutes. I just wanted to put this picture here of this crowd because I wanted to acknowledge that I don't think that any of these strategies are going to work in isolation. And I know that there's a temptation when things are overwhelming to just get in your office and huddle down. I think maybe we can do that in some places, but I think this is not one of them. It's very messy. I'm part of a food co-op in New York, and it's wonderful. I think one of the largest in the country, 15,000 members. But every once in a while, I go to the monthly general meeting just to sort of experience democracy in action. And sometimes the antics, are so nuanced that they get into the New York Times and people make fun of us. But it's just hard work, right? There's nothing that is going to make a co-op operation, operate well with 15,000 people if you don't really spend a lot of time hashing out details. And so that's my cautionary note, that almost everything I'm suggesting involves working collaboratively. So investment strategy. Again, we know how to do this. Incorporating the just transition here. We have spent a lot of work, investors have over the last number of years, thinking about how to include ESG in our strategy. So why not include the social dimension in our climate work? And then how might we involve key stakeholders in that process? I know from the pension funds, and I've asked around, when do you talk to your beneficiaries? There aren't vehicles from which we are able to really have that kind of dialogue. There's examples of it, but I think we need to do more. The investment beliefs framing, I think, is a great thing that a lot of pension funds and other investors have picked up. It started with the Dutch funds. My experience at SEIU when I was a trustee in our Taft-Hartley fund was we incorporated ESG into our investment policy statement. And one of the funds that's really picked up the just transition in their policy is a fund called IRCONTEC, which is, I'm not pronouncing it right, a French public sector scheme that has actually adopted the just transition at the policy level. And they said they did it partly because at the heart of their values is intergenerational solidarity. So a whole nother approach to take on the just transition. And then investor engagement. Again, I mentioned this, we know how to do it. I think that probably most of us on the call, the few that I know, have been to shareholder meetings. We've written shareholder resolutions. We've engaged with companies. How might we do this? I listed the TCFD implementation up there just because there isn't much. We went through it to look for human rights and other worker and community issues, and there's more to do. But we have frameworks. We can add to those frameworks. We're already working with companies on scenario planning. We can add the just transition into that. So one effort we've been talking to is the Climate Action 100. So for people who don't know, a new effort by global investors to band together. I think there's $30 trillion of assets already signed up to the project, that they engage in a more powerful way with the top 100 plus emitters. And they've included just transition in their frame. And so we're going to figure out how to implement that with them. And then just one other example is from Canada. The Shareholder Association for Research and Education, SHARE, has this past year picked up, the past few months really, the just transition as part of their engagement strategy. They've approached 4 utilities already that are planning plant closures of coal-fired generating facilities in North America. And they've inquired about their just transition strategy. So they have a special focus also, not just on the company strategy, but the impacts on the indigenous community. So I don't know that they've had a lot of back and forth yet. I think it's too early to tell, but they're starting to ask the questions, which I think is important. And so I have listed here, and I won't dwell on this page because there's too many words, just some questions to ask companies. Again, with the theme of we already know how to talk to companies, let's just add this in. And the guide that we're releasing next week has a whole lot more questions to ask. So the one that I'll pick out, because I think it's not necessarily familiar to U.S. investors, is social dialogue, or as familiar perhaps, but I think the trade unions globally have really focused on social dialogue as a way to activate the just transition, which means companies are talking to workers, their unions, and communities, and are putting in grievance mechanisms. So that's, I think, an important thing for us to look at, what's happening in other places. And I mentioned a couple examples, and now, for example, that has done a social dialogue. I'm just going to keep going. So capital allocation.
One question, sorry, Vonda.
Yeah, go ahead.
You mentioned explicitly engagement with companies and questions for companies. Are you also thinking of this or a separate set of questions that one could ask managers?
Yes, I don't think that the questions have to be separate necessarily. I think that if you look at those questions, I'll just go back for a second. We can also ask these questions for managers to reach out to our portfolio companies and our consultants. We have a lot of service providers, and I think not all of us are resourced enough to do the kind of one-on-one company engagement. But having our managers, asking them these questions, and then having our consultants as well, I think is certainly a direction that we should go.
Right, and it would just require, I guess, some additional elements on how this gets rolled up to the level or to the management level. Yeah.
Yeah, and when you look at, the capital allocation question, right, you actually can do this proactively as opposed to sort of in an engagement process, right? We can invest in ways that we put in our RFPs, we ask our consultants who are looking for products for us that we want labor and social standards in them, right? And so I go through here sort of a number of different ways we might do that. And I'll just, perhaps I'll list through some of the investment opportunities that we think investors could consider with a just transition lens. So in our cash portfolio, we could focus on banks that have just transition lending strategies around green jobs and place-based development and CDFI. And again, I'm not saying anything that people don't already know, perhaps, and aren't already doing. So this is just to list up the whole group. For fixed income, we could target bonds that are linked to sectoral or regional transition plans. And, you know, for example, the green bonds that might have a ring fence that would be allocated to specific areas. In our public equities portfolio, we could identify listed companies that are focused on environmental solutions in regions, reward companies that are trying to figure this out. And then in private equity, we could seek impact investment funds that are linking climate and job quality. And I know that, I don't know if Delilah's on, I think so. I think Pegasus is trying to figure this out. She can talk about that more later, perhaps. And then in real assets, we can target investments in communities that are impacted by the transition. And this one really was brought home to me when I was talking to the Australian Shadow Minister for Climate. We don't have such a thing in the U.S., but they're developing a whole just transition platform. And he was very familiar with the example I cited about Latrobe Valley, where a coal-fired plant was announced as part of a broad set of closures in Australia 2 or 3 years down the road, and then abruptly the company shuttered the plant and caught people off guard. So there was really no time for transition. They have now forged an agreement. I think people are skeptical that it will be just, but they're giving it a go. But when I was talking to the climate minister, he said, you know, the part of Australia that this has impacted is the Latrobe Valley, which is really just outside of Melbourne, 150 kilometers. And you would think, because it's such a heavily industrialized region, that people might find work elsewhere. They're going to have to, right, because of the high industrial nature of the area. But the transportation system is so poor that people can't get back and forth to a really rapidly growing city with a high demand and high need for the workers that are in the Latrobe Valley. So infrastructure is really on his mind, and I think we could think about places in the U.S. where it's the same scenario. Heavily industrialized regions, based, you know, the jobs are based in industries that are closing, and how might those workers connect with jobs that might be in a different place, and is the infrastructure in existence to provide what workers need to get to and from work. So just a couple things for us to think about. And then I just wanted to mention policy dialogue too, because again, here I have all these global efforts where some investors have picked up or joined the table really to talk about this. But I think for many of us, it's going to happen locally. There's an effort that people might be familiar with called the C40, which is a cities-based effort around climate. And I know that New York City and London are thinking about the just transition in their region. And might investors participate in a dialogue and join forces with cities as they try to figure this out? So I think that offers a lot of opportunity for us. In my experience, and people might come at this from a different place than I do, but when I was working in the labor movement, and my experience with the public pension funds was that the policy dialogue was not something they did much of. I think it's especially remarkable all the work that's been done with the SEC. That's one place we felt like we could advocate, and that's great, but are there other places we might bring an investor voice around policy issues? Something to think about. And then the last place I think that investors can take action is really develop the field. We want to create a vanguard of funds to form a learning community, and would welcome everyone's participation in that. And then this challenge, I think, of really understanding how information is, what's the chain of information that goes back and forth between investors and communities. And I think that some of us have tripped up against that when we thought we were doing the right thing, and then the community says, wait, why did you withdraw that shareholder resolution? Or why are you making that investment? It harms us. But we don't actually have, and I think some people are figuring it out, how to have the kind of data and social media and relationships with membership organizations that might provide the feedback that we need in order to do this right. So I'm winding up. I'm going to try to wrap it up, and so we can have time for some questions and a discussion if possible. So I just wanted to highlight a couple places to start. We call these my favorites. And the first one is to rethink ESG. Again, not that folks haven't figured this out before, but E, S, and G are often in silos. Here's a pretty picture of silos, and what would it look like if we had one? Maybe not for the corn, but for the way we approach it. And I think this is really best thought about in terms of a couple of examples. I'm going to San Francisco next week as part of the Global Climate Action Summit, and then we have meetings as part of the Committee on Workers' Capital and the PRI. Other people might be going. And we're holding the Just Transition Center session, rather, that everyone's invited to, and hopefully Andrea can share a link afterwards, at the offices of Unite HERE, which is a union local that represents hotel workers in San Francisco. They are trying to decide whether or not to go on strike. Their talks with Marriott in particular have not gone anywhere as they try to develop a new contract. And so I think this is an interesting example. I'll get to the ESG because Marriott has done this whole program, which people might have seen either at Marriott or other hotels, where they say, don't dump your towels on the floor. And if you don't want your room cleaned, you can go green, right? So everyone thinks, oh, yes, we don't need to create more laundry and bleach. So you check that little box, you put that little sticker on your bed. And what Marriott has done is they've used that program to slash the hours of their workers. The workers have as much work because those rooms are dirtier after a couple of days of not cleaning, but the hours have been diminished to below the minimum that's required to provide benefits. And so it's a huge hardship on the workforce, and so it's a form of greenwashing. And we also know that Marriott is now part of Host, which is a REIT, notorious for governance problems. And so I feel like if we could connect these three, maybe on the E they're doing something good, but if we connect the G and the S into it, we might get a more complete picture of what's happening at the company. And then my other favorite example is Tesla. I can't help myself. I really have to join the chorus against Elon Musk that we've seen the last couple of weeks. But here's a company that really hits all of the E buttons. Yes, they're making electric cars. It's really cool. And yet, on the S and the G, it's a complete failure. So there was a headline last month in The Guardian, actually in July, that said about Tesla, all humanity has left the area. And so they're talking about how in Nevada, to pay for their huge battery factory, they wrestled out lots of tax breaks, which have really depleted local coffers, and so the town cannot pay for public services. Is that the trade-off that we're faced with? I hope not. And then in Fremont, California, some folks have heard this story from workers who can't afford to live there. The cost of living is so high. Wages have really diminished from the days when the Tesla factory was a Nissan plant. And Tesla there has double the health and safety violations of other auto factories. And then, of course, the governance problems. Can we talk about what's going on at Tesla's board and the lack of separation of chair and CEO by Elon Musk, by the board of Elon Musk? And so I think, again, if these issues are taken as a package, we get a much better picture of, do we want to be invested in this company? So that leads me to an area that I am not an expert, but this is where I'm hoping to spend my energy over the next coming months, and that is place-based investing. This is a picture of Yorkshire, one of the biggest textile centers of the globe at one time, still a huge industrial region in the UK, and a partnership that our project, my colleagues in London are working on, focused on the Humber, which is the most carbon-intensive industrial area in the UK. So what they're doing is they're taking the guide that we're developing on the just transition, and they're going to try to implement it in a region. And they've created a table that includes everybody you want there. They have the university at Leeds, government officials, NGOs, the trade unions from the TUC, companies, and investors. So I think this is going to be a place to watch and then see if we can learn some lessons. In Quebec, another favorite story of mine is the Solidarity Funds. These were started in the 80s. That are now $13.7 billion under management, and it's a fund, a supplementary savings fund for the Quebecois, can't say that right, to really focus on growing the local economy. So that's the mandate, to create jobs and protect them through investments in small and medium-sized businesses. And so they're investing in things like electric school buses and taxis, and in a company that manufactures biofuels. They're also purchasing green bonds from the Quebec government. So they're actually doing this and talking about it, and hopefully we can learn from them as well. I would love to have a Solidarity Fund here. So the US, I mentioned the Just Transition Fund, and other efforts really I think that have been led by frontline communities. Through groups like the Climate Justice Alliance and Movement Generation, to think about the role of communities in the just transition. And then one final example in India, where the development finance institutions have started to think about the just transition. The UK's, which is called the CDC, and they've established a program in India called Ayana, which is a renewable energy company. And they identified recently that there's a huge skills gap for workers in the solar sector. And so they're partnering with SEIU, which is the Self-Employed Women's Association, sort of the women's union in India, to train local women in these jobs. And they have a website, which I can share. So there's things happening, and I think probably lots more examples from people on the phone. So then why don't I end with the purpose of finance? And can we use the just transition as a frame to figure out ways to serve the real economy that benefits everyone? So that's my hope. I recently heard that there's an infrastructure fund that had in its charter the phrase, profit is possible without exploitation. I thought, oh, that's good. I want to believe that profit is possible without exploitation. But I think we need to go beyond that. And let me just close by talking about the seventh generation principle, which comes from the founding document of the Iroquois Confederacy, a much maligned statement that's been used for marketing, and we've appropriated that like other things for the Native American community, but I think it's a great frame. The statement is based on the philosophy that in our every deliberation, we must consider the impact of our decisions on the next 7 generations. So thinking about that and thinking about how we consider the next 7 generations in our energy use and in our relationships, I think is very much a guide for how to do this work. So with that, I'll just say here's what we're going to do. I already talked about the meetings next week. If you're going to be in San Francisco, let me know. And then we're hoping to push this agenda at COP in Poland in December, and then hopefully be able to start to implement the guidance with this investor vanguard that I mentioned, and really focusing on some place-based work. If you want to know more, the discussion paper is linked there, and I don't know, Andrea, if you're going to send out the slides, which is fine. And then the guidance document, we'll put a link in next week. There's my email and all the other partners on the project, David Wood, and then my colleagues who are at the LSE. So that's it. I don't know how to do a discussion with WebEx, but maybe you can tell me, Andrea.
Wonderful. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Vonda, for all the work that you've done on this, and to David and Nick as well. And thank you for taking the time to present this to us today. In terms of how we're going to do it, people are more than welcome to put their questions in chat, as they've already been doing, or unmute themselves and speak up. We'd love to hear directly from folks. Cambria, if you're still on the line and if you'd like to chime in, by all means. I know Anair and Delilah were also on if they want to say something. And while you all sort out your questions or unmute yourselves, I'll bring up a couple of things that came through the chat. One is whether there is an intersection of the Just Transition Framework with the Opportunity Zones legislation, or the Opportunity Zones regulation that will be coming out, whether that's something that folks are looking at, maybe in the place-based context in the U.S. There is something. I don't know, Vonda, if you all have looked at that, or somebody else on the line.
Yes, I think that there's definitely legislation that's being put in place in other countries. And I think we should be ready at a federal level to do the same. And then certainly local and state level legislation that would really govern. I think the tax issues are a place for us to explore how we might use those to the benefit of you know, workers in a transition and also impacted communities. So I'm not an expert on writing legislation, but again, I think it's a great point, and we should do it. I don't know that our project will, but I think it is happening. And some of the cities that I mentioned as part of C40, I know are working on model legislation.
Great, thank you. And another quick thing that came through from one of our members. So, you know, we're talking about something that is fairly major here. We talked about the 30 trillion in the Climate 100 plus. What about the smaller investors, you know, the very proactive family offices, foundations, and the like? Do you see a difference in how they can best play a role in this?
I actually think that it's joined together. I think that, you know, even the Climate Action 100, some of the dialogues are being led by very small investors. Our very little fund, the UA Endowment Fund, is leading one with CalPERS. So I think it's, you know, a chance for the small and large to work together. And I think, you know, there's a resource question too, right? It's, again, I'm very mindful of the resources that it takes to do these kinds of dialogues. And I really want to applaud ICCR, the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, because it's an incredible amount of work that they and their members take on to go to companies, and they've got a very good track record on climate issues. And I know that human rights is being folded into it, and hopefully this work around just transition too. So I think there's a lot that's, you know, we can really stand on the shoulders of.
Great, thank you. So yeah, now I would encourage anybody to jump in who would like to. In particular, I see several names there of folks that have been thinking about this for a while. In particular, if you have any feedback for Vonda or anything that you might feel strongly about or even disagree with, right? There's a framework that I understand in the process has been fairly open in terms of taking feedback and differing opinions. So anybody that wants to jump in, feel free to do so.
Hey, this is Delilah. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah. Hi, Delilah. Yeah, we can hear you.
Thanks for a great presentation, and really, really interesting stuff. As Vonda mentioned, I work with Pegasus Capital Advisors. There's just some feedback, so I pause. I work with Pegasus Capital Advisors, and we're a private equity fund manager, and we focus on sustainability and wellness. And one of the investments that I think, you know, sort of speaks to the opportunity zone question as well as inclusive growth is our investment in a company called Renaissance Downtowns, which is doing some sustainable urban revitalization around areas of mass transit. And, you know, one of the company's key goals is to reduce urban sprawl, but and in that sense, it's reducing climate risk, and it's working on building sustainable infrastructure and sustainable buildings, but they're doing it with deep community engagement and reaching out to local organizations and underrepresented organizations that are giving a voice to underrepresented communities to provide input into how the urban development should take place, and that's through restructuring the zoning code of these areas where the company is operating. And so I think that that's it's an interesting approach that we've explored, and I just bring it up because, Vonda, you mentioned that I might share an example of work being done in the private equity space. You know, some of the other things that we're exploring beyond that are, you know, are there investments that can absorb workers that are being shed in the transition from, you know, the old economy to new? And then, you know, where are other opportunities where we can develop in underserved areas, but make sure that we're including people. So one thing that we've looked at is development in Mexico. We haven't really gotten too involved there, but really working with indigenous people. And we've looked at a few opportunities with different developers and business folks there. So, so I think, you know, those are some examples on the private equity side. And I also have some questions, but I'll just stop there because I don't want to monopolize the remaining time on the call.
Well, feel free, Delilah. Thanks for your comment to put in a couple of questions, and then Vonda can address a bunch of them as they come in.
Hi, it's Nancy McPherson here. I've worked with the Rockefeller Foundation for the last 10 years and have just stepped down to work with some organizations, Slum Dwellers International, around innovative finance and how one works to shift some of the power of decision-making on investments for the urban poor to the global south. I think this is a huge thing that we can push on. Many of the boards are dominated by global north, often very white male, but yet many of the benefits of investments are supposed to be in the global south. So that's one. And Vonda, I'll put you in touch with the SEI team that's going to be next week at the climate, at the C40 and at the climate talks, and they would love to meet you, and I think you'd enjoy them. My second point is I'm also involved with a group called Global Infrastructure Basel, and they are a group that have developed infrastructure standards for sustainable infrastructure, and that takes into account all the international conventions. So there's a spider web of standards that that infrastructure should meet, that takes into account human rights, climate, basically exceeding the planetary boundaries. It's really excellent. And they've done mapping against the SDGs, and 70% of the SDGs are dependent on having sustainable infrastructure. I had not thought about that before, but it's true. Water, housing, roads, all the rest. So there are ways, I think, through standard setting that we can start to promote the concrete and operational ways of making this happen. But I guess one first has to be at the table, and I appreciate the examples you've raised today of how you actually get to the table to even begin the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Nancy. Vonda, up to you if you would like to address this.
Hello? Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to thank Nancy for the standards example, because I think that's a great way for us to think about this. There are standards, and I can share some of them. We've developed as part of the Committee on Workers' Capital around our shareholder issues that would incorporate the just transition, and I think infrastructure is another really good place to develop standards. So thanks for that. And then I know that Transform Finance has done a lot of work to think about how to shift the decision-making and include impact to communities, and I think that's another area that the just transition provides a lot of great room to work. So I hope that people pick that up and continue that work. And then I just wanted to ask Delilah to, hopefully there'll be some sort of case study out of the Renaissance example, because I think to have a private equity firm engage local communities on developing what kind of restructuring they want and then changing the zoning code is really very exciting. Private equity has not really been a friend to workers, and it's been a struggle. But I don't want to, I think that you're sort of proving that there's another way to do it, and that's really helpful. So thank you for that. I don't know if there are any other questions, Andrea, but I just like the idea that people are going to be in touch with me and, give me lots of great examples. That's super helpful.
Yeah, I think Anair has a...
Yeah, I was going to, if we have a few minutes, I'm happy to share a couple of examples. Hi, Vonda. This is Anair with the Candide Group, and we work with clients that are actively investing with a strong commitment to social justice and kind of transform finance principles. And I think in general, as we invest in clean energy and sustainability, we try to apply this lens, the kind of the just transition lens, and the way we frame it is we say, the accelerated adoption of clean energy is sort of happening. It's happening fast because of just sort of market economics, right? And the economics of clean energy, and sort of our role is applying this lens and trying to account for impact on workers, customers, and communities. And so I can just like quick examples on those three groups and kind of how we've thought about it as an investment lens. So from a from a worker perspective, some of the displaced jobs and kind of the need to create new opportunities in communities that are affected by the industries that are on the decline. So work like we've supported a solar business in West Virginia called Solar Hauler that works to kind of retrain former coal workers and put them to work installing solar systems in West Virginia. So that's kind of the worker sort of axis, or the worker lens. And then more on the customer side, really focusing in on who are the customers that are gaining access to clean energy and are benefiting from the economics of clean energy, making sure that it's not just kind of a rich people's offering, right? And so things like we supported, we invested in a company called Posigen down in Louisiana that's really focused on reaching LMI, low to moderate income customers with their model, and have been quite successful. And we've also supported a company called Clean Choice Energy that's been a leading player in the community solar space, so really making solar accessible to renters and lower income families. So that's kind of the customer angle, and making sure that there's more, I guess, broad-based access to this new, this new economy. Mm-hmm. And then thirdly, more on the community side, thinking about sort of who's getting hurt and who's benefiting from the projects themselves. So We've supported a couple of project developers that have really promoted models where communities have an active stake or participation or revenue share coming from the projects. We have a couple of examples in sub-Saharan Africa, like a project that a company called Gigawatt Global built in Rwanda, and sort of the community engagement and participation around that project. So I think those are kind of the three, probably the three buckets that kind of how we try to apply that lens. Just to maybe add one point to what Andrea said earlier in terms of that transition and the impact on workers and the fact that the kind of the solar economy is not necessarily going to be a one-to-one substitute, right, for the old industry. So there, I mentioned the example in West Virginia earlier. So we're all for it, and we're all for building a vibrant clean energy economy in West Virginia. But there's also the kind of the risk of misrepresenting the opportunity or overstating the opportunity, right? So this company, for example, was featured in the New York Times, this company in West Virginia, with some very kind of rosy statements about how the new economy, the new solar economy is where the opportunity lies for the former coal workers. Now that company at the time was employing about 6 people, right? And hardly the news that the coal miners were kind of looking for at the time. So you also kind of have the reputational risk of that kind of backfiring and the community sort of saying, "Give me a break," right? And so the other. It's just kind of, I think the positioning there. It's more about the positioning than anything in that case, I think. The other, just quick example on that note is we're talking to a company that's a developer, a project developer in Navajo country, working to develop solar projects, large utility scale solar projects on Navajo reservations. But when you look again at kind of the impact that they are trying to offset of a former massive coal plant that just closed, that coal plant, I think the economic impact or the royalty payments from that the coal business on the Navajo community was about $50 million a year. Which would require, if you were looking to sort of substitute that on a one-to-one basis using solar projects, we're talking about something along the lines of 5 gigawatt of solar projects, right? Which would be not what we're expecting, right? To see. But so again, all for developing a solar industry in that region as part of economic development, but you also don't want to kind of over-represent that this is going to be the savior or the one-to-one substitute for the lost economic activity.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Anair. I don't know if people can hear me. Yes. Okay. All right. Yes. I think that the local examples that you just provided sort of put a lot of texture into sort of my broad frame, and then also just the challenge, right, of how we do this sort of one investment at a time, and then making sure that we're having an impact. But yes, it's pretty massive when you think about the job loss and the demand that's needed. In light of the fact that Andrea referenced at the beginning, really the changing nature of work and how much is now, going to be impacted by changes in technology and how much is now contingent work. So I just feel like, I don't want to get depressed, but we should go at it and work on these projects and then learn from one another. I saw one question, a correction from Cambria, that I overstated the human capital management work with the SEC. I know it's ongoing, but it's not happening next week. So sorry about that. And then also, Frank Sherman asked about the business case. So there's a lot more that could be said about the business case. It's where we often get stuck, I think, as investors, and we have to tackle this. So we've approached it from, you know, some of the things that I mentioned. You know, if you tack ES and G together, it's harder for companies to squeeze out from one or the other. But also just our interest for many of us as long-term owners and as universal owners. And then I think in some countries, maybe more than this one, the social license to operate is something that has consequences for companies. So there's more, and I can send it to you offline, Frank, if you want. But yes, we have to develop that and make sure we're communicating with our investment teams on the need here. So should we wrap up? Because I want to make sure that I think I neglected to mention the people that are funding the work at LSE and at Harvard. So it's PRI, the Principles for Responsible Investment, and then in the UK, it's the Friends Provident Foundation, and in the US, it's Sturna. So I want to thank them for having confidence in us, and then especially the community here on the call and Andrea for the leadership that you've shown and for creating a place for me.
Well, thank you, Vonda. And there is one last thing, if you don't mind, that was happening here in the background that if you can address it would be helpful. And it is around that the point that you mentioned at the beginning from the European Commission, right? The notion of the net benefit to workers and communities. Mm-hmm. And as Delilah was talking about the private equity example, and as you remarked, right, private equity historically has not been a friend of workers or a friend of labor or of unions. We were looking at this just transition piece as something that could be creating like a model for the type of engagement that you could see throughout the economy, right? That should not be limited to a just transition piece in itself. I'm trying to reconcile all this with the wealth creation and wealth inequality aspect of the fate of workers in the just transition. As came up in some of the chats, clearly it's already those that are most marginalized. That and definitely on the poorer side of wealth inequality that are dealing with this. So I'm still having a bit of a hard time seeing how this framework can both embody considerations of wealth inequality, non-extractiveness as we talk about it, and reach that scale where the 30 trillion of the climate action 100 plus whatever might be interested in it. So is there an intentional lens around the broader kind of wealth and power inequality issues in the just transition?
So I think that it's a huge question, and it's actually the question that kind of has spurred me into this project. Because as you heard from my own story, I feel very strongly that our financial system is not set up to benefit the people that I care most about. And so if we will have a transition, and I think a lot of, as you've seen, a number of products come online, many in the financial industry are setting themselves up to take advantage of that, and yet it's being built on our same system. So, you know, you can sort of project what's going to happen. So if we don't find some ways to disrupt that, I think engagement is important, but I think also some of the work around new financial models is going to be very important to bring into it. And I also think these questions of impact investing that you raised around developing principles behind them, bringing these concepts to larger institutional investors who frankly haven't grappled with this. But I think that because of hopefully the just transition, hopefully something like the Sustainable Development Goals, that they're being forced to contend with these tougher issues. So I don't have any answers to your question. I just think that that's the work that's in front of us.
Yeah, I mean, one positive spin on that is that at least this is putting it on the radar, right? The fact that you're not looking at it out of context, and hopefully a lot of the players will see the intersection between the, SDG, no poverty, and the climate issues that we're looking at and everything else.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Vonda. Thank you to everybody that participated, and especially those that contributed with their questions and and comments, please do reach out to Vonda. We'll be able to share the deck with those that registered, and then on the 14th, when the guidance is released, we can send it to a group if they're interested. And if you are interested in learning more about the work of Transform Finance or the Investor Network, please do get in touch with us. So thank you very much, Vonda, for all the work and for joining us today.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay.
Take care. Bye-bye.